The wind roared through the darkness like an enraged beast, hurling sheets of icy snow against the world. Jack Holloway sat hunched over the cluttered table in his small, forgotten cabin at the edge of Timber Ridge. His hands trembled slightly as he cradled a chipped mug of black coffee, steam swirling up to meet the shadows on his weathered face. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, its warmth barely reaching him despite the effort it took to keep it alive. Jack's cabin was a lonely fortress, buried deep in the wilderness where the world's cruelty couldn't reach him. His days were spent in grueling isolation, chopping wood, scavenging for supplies, and nursing old wounds both physical and emotional. It had been nearly 10 years since the accident, and the pain clung to him like frostbite, cold, relentless, and unforgiving. He glanced over to the faded photograph resting on the mantel. His wife, Laura, and their little girl, Emily, smiling under the summer sun. The accident had stolen them both away, leaving Jack's heart hollowed out and bleeding. Since then, he'd sworn off the world, choosing exile over the pitying stares of neighbors and friends. No one ventured this far into the mountains to bother him, and he liked it that way. The storm had been raging for hours, a merciless blizzard that silenced the night's usual tranquility. But then, through the furious howling of the wind, came a sound so foreign Jack almost believed he'd imagined it. A frantic, desperate banging at his door. He froze, his fingers tightening around the mug. No one came out this far, not even the occasional hiker or hunter who had lost their way. His nearest neighbor was miles away, and the storm was fierce enough to drive even the hardiest traveler to shelter. The banging continued, sharper this time, the pounding so frantic it made his skin prickle with unease. Jack rose from his chair, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. As he reached the door, his heart hammered in his chest, a dull and painful reminder that he was still alive. He yanked the door open, and the wind crashed into him, slicing through his thick flannel shirt and sending icy claws down his spine. But it wasn't the cold that left him stunned. It was the sight before him. Two tiny figures stood huddled together on his porch, their bodies shivering so violently it was a miracle they were even still standing. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old, their matching dark hair matted with snow, their cheeks flushed red from the biting cold. "Please, mister," one of the girls spoke, her voice trembling but steady with a strange, fierce determination. "We're so cold. Can you help us?" Jack's gaze darted between the two girls, disbelief twisting his features. His first instinct was to slam the door shut and pretend he'd never seen them. What business did he have letting anyone into his broken world, especially not two innocent children? But then the other girl, the quieter one, let out a choked sob, her thin shoulders sagging as her strength began to give way. The brave one clung to her sister's hand, her eyes pleading even as her lips turned a dangerous shade of blue. Jack's breath caught. Something about them, about their desperate courage, cracked open the bitter defenses he'd spent years building around his heart. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn them away, he pulled the door wide and stepped aside. "Get in here now," he said, his voice rough and unfamiliar, the sound of it like gravel in his throat. The girls stumbled over the threshold, their feet dragging across the wooden floor as they collapsed into a heap near the fire. Jack hurried to shut the door, bolting it against the cruel storm outside. The howling wind was silenced, leaving only the crackling fire and the ragged, shallow breathing of the two girls. "What the hell are you two doing out there?" Jack demanded, his words harsher than intended. His social skills had long since rusted, his ability to show kindness buried beneath years of grief. The brave girl looked up at him, her eyes glassy but determined. "We were lost. Our mom told us to wait in the car, but she didn't come back. And then it got really cold." Jack's chest tightened painfully. He had to force himself to breathe, to keep his own memories from tearing him apart. "How long were you out there?" "I don't know. A long time." Her voice cracked, and her small hands wrapped around her sister protectively. "Please, mister. We didn't know where else to go. We just saw the light through the trees. Jack rubbed his hands over his face, the stubble on his chin scratching against his palms. His mind spun as he tried to make sense of it all. 2 lost girls wandering through a blizzard, a mother who'd vanished, and his cabin, a place he'd fought so hard to keep separate from the world, suddenly invaded by the most vulnerable of creatures. "Okay," he said gruffly, shoving the panic away. "You need to warm up before anything else. Take those wet coats off and sit by the fire. I'll get some blankets." He disappeared into the back room, his hands shaking as he rummaged through the storage chest. His fingers closed around 2 wool blankets, their rough texture unfamiliar after so many years untouched. When he returned, the girls were sitting close to the fire, their faces bathed in a soft, amber glow. The quiet one was crying silently, tears streaking down her cheeks as her sister whispered reassuring words Jack couldn't quite make out. He draped the blankets over their thin shoulders, his movements stiff but careful. The girls pulled the fabric around themselves eagerly, their bodies slowly unwinding from the tension of the cold. Jack stared at them, his own discomfort battling against a surge of emotions he'd kept locked away for so long. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm Sophie," said the brave one, her chin lifted in a defiant attempt to appear stronger than she was. "And this is my sister, Lily." "All right, Sophie and Lily," Jack said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Let's get you something warm to drink. Then you're gonna tell me everything." He turned to the small kitchen area, his hands moving on autopilot as he prepared 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. The silence behind him was heavy, the kind that filled spaces where words couldn't reach. But as he poured the hot liquid and carried the mugs to the girls, something inside him stirred. A fragile, painful hope that maybe, just maybe, his own broken world wasn't as beyond saving as he'd thought. Jack watched the girls clutch the steaming mugs with fingers so tiny and pale he feared they might shatter if he looked at them too hard. They sipped at the cocoa, their eyes still darting around his cabin like cornered animals, searching for the nearest escape. Sophie, the braver of the 2, kept her body half turned toward Lily, her arm draped protectively over her sister's shoulders. Jack's chest tightened at the sight. Even through his bitterness and isolation, he could recognize pure, undiluted love when he saw it, and it only made him feel the ache of his own loss that much more. He slumped into the rickety armchair across from them, his knees creaking as much as the old wood beneath him. For a while, he let the silence do the talking, hoping the warmth of the fire and the drink would coax the fear from their eyes. But the only thing more relentless than a mountain storm was his curiosity and his suspicion. "Your mom," Jack began, his voice gruff, unsteady. "You said she left you in the car. When was that?" Sophie swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the mug she cradled like it was her last lifeline. "I don't know. It was daytime when she went. Said she was going to find help. We waited and waited, but she never came back." Jack's mouth went dry. How could a mother abandon her children in a storm like this? The anger that rose up in him was swift and hot, but he tempered it, knowing his rage would do nothing but frighten them further. And as much as he wanted to send them away, shove them back into whatever nightmare they'd crawled out of, something deeper within him refused to allow it. "Where was the car?" he asked, his tone softer than before, even if only slightly. "On the road, or what was left of it. It was buried under all the snow. We tried to stay in the car, but it got so cold, and when we ran out of snacks, I told Lily we had to leave or we'd never make it." Her voice cracked and Jack saw the fierce determination in her eyes waver, the fragility of a child playing brave finally surfacing. He ran a hand over his jaw, his fingers rasping against the unkempt beard. "And you walked all this way? In a blizzard? Through the woods?" Sophie nodded, her eyes meeting his with the defiant challenge of someone who'd seen far too much for her age. "We didn't have a choice." Jack rubbed his temples, trying to force his jumbled thoughts into some kind of order. What was he supposed to do now? Two little girls dumped at his doorstep, with nothing but frostbite and a story of abandonment. He couldn't just turn them away, even if every part of him screamed that he should. "All right," he grumbled. "You girls stay here. I'm gonna see if I can find your car. Maybe your mom made it back and you just missed her." He knew it was a lie the second it left his mouth. Sophie probably did too, but the glimmer of hope it sparked in her eyes made him feel like a monster. He grabbed his coat and shoved his feet into his snow boots, his hands clenching and unclenching as he wrestled with his decision. "Stay by the fire. Don't touch anything. And don't open the door for anyone but me, you hear?" "Yes, sir," Sophie whispered, her voice carrying the tremor of a child trying so hard to be grown. Lily only nodded, her tiny frame still shivering beneath the blanket. Jack hesitated before pushing through the door and out into the raging storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and cutting through his thick layers of clothing with vicious precision. But he pushed on, his steps heavy as he trudged through knee-deep snow. Branches whipped against his face, icy tendrils clawing at his skin as he fought his way through the forest. It took him nearly an hour to find the car, a rusted heap half buried beneath the merciless white. His heart sank at the sight of the shattered windows and the desperate footprints leading away from the wreck. Whatever hope he'd been clinging to evaporated like breath on a winter morning. The woman was gone, long gone. The storm had likely swallowed her whole, erasing her from the world with the same ruthless efficiency it had once tried to claim him. Jack's fists clenched, the muscles in his jaw tightening until they throbbed. How could someone leave their children to die out here? How could anyone be that cruel? He checked the car for anything useful. Blankets, food, a working phone. Nothing. Just a broken-down shell and the faint echo of lives torn apart. His own fury churned beneath the surface, an old friend he'd grown too comfortable with over the years. But this time, the anger didn't feel like something he could just bury and forget, because it wasn't just his pain he was dealing with now. It was theirs too. He turned back, his boots sinking into the fresh snow with every step. The journey back felt even longer than the trek out, his thoughts a swirling mass of grief and guilt and reluctant responsibility. When he finally reached the cabin, the heat of the fire was a shock against his frozen skin. The girls looked up at him with wide, searching eyes, and he knew the truth would crush whatever hope they had left. But what was he supposed to do? Lie to them? Give them some false reassurance that everything would be all right? "Your car's done for," Jack said, his voice flat. "And there's no sign of your mom." Lily burst into tears, the sound raw and broken. Sophie wrapped her arms around her sister, murmuring words of comfort that Jack couldn't quite catch. He felt like he was intruding on something sacred, something he had no right to witness. But the look Sophie gave him wasn't angry or accusing. It was pleading. Desperate. "What are we gonna do now?" she asked, her voice trembling with the effort it took to keep herself from falling apart. Jack swallowed hard, his throat thick and dry. He could send them away. Tell them to keep walking, to find someone better suited to saving them. But as he stared into Sophie's weary, determined eyes and Lily's tear-streaked face, something inside him cracked. "You're gonna stay here," Jack said, his words gruff and final. "At least until the storm's passed." He tried to sound like it was just a temporary solution, that he'd be rid of them soon enough. But deep down, he knew better. The girls weren't just passing through his life. They'd shattered the ice around his heart with their simple, devastating need. And there was no turning back now. The storm raged on through the night, the wind howling like a wounded animal as snow piled against the cabin walls. Jack barely slept, his nerves stretched taut as wires. His old cot creaked under his restless weight, but it wasn't the cold or the groaning of the cabin's bones that kept him awake. It was the girls. They huddled together on the threadbare couch, wrapped in every blanket he could scavenge. Even in sleep, Sophie's arms stayed protectively around Lily's shoulders, her fingers gripping the fabric of her sister's shirt, like she was afraid Lily might vanish into the darkness if she let go. Jack couldn't stop looking at them, couldn't stop the memories from clawing their way to the surface. He'd once held his own little girl like that. Emma, with her wild curls and laughter that could light up the world. His chest tightened, the ache of her absence so sharp he almost doubled over from it. By dawn, Jack's eyes were raw, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He forced himself out of bed and stoked the fire until it roared, its heat licking at the chill that seeped through the walls. The storm had eased, but only slightly. Enough for the world outside to be painted in endless shades of white, the sky still swollen with the threat of more snow to come. He cooked breakfast with the efficiency of a man who'd spent years living alone. The eggs sizzled in the skillet, their scent mingling with the faint traces of smoke and pine that clung to the air. He hadn't been sure if the girls would be hungry, but the hollow look in their eyes last night told him otherwise. "Here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended as he handed them 2 plates piled high with scrambled eggs and toast. "Eat." Lily's eyes went wide, her little hands trembling as she accepted the plate. Sophie hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the food like she expected him to snatch it away at any moment. "You trying to poison us or something?" she asked, the fire in her tone at odds with the desperation in her expression. Jack's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile cracking through the ice. "If I wanted you gone, I wouldn't have let you in last night." Sophie considered that, her shoulders relaxing by the smallest fraction. Then she dug into her food like a starving animal, the ferocity of her hunger making Jack's stomach twist. Lily followed her sister's lead, though her movements were slower, more tentative. She chewed with tiny bites, her eyes darting nervously between her plate and Jack's stern face. "What's your name?" she asked quietly, her voice like the first fragile notes of a song. "Jack," he replied, the word coming out gruffer than he meant. "Jack Carter." "Thank you, Jack," Lily whispered, her sincerity slicing through his defenses more effectively than any weapon ever could. "Yeah," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Don't mention it." The girls finished their food in silence, Sophie licking her plate clean while Lily offered her plate back with a shy, grateful smile. Jack took the dishes and set them in the sink, his hands clenching the edge of the counter as he tried to sort through the chaos of his own thoughts. He couldn't keep them here. They needed help, real help, but the nearest town was nearly 20 miles away, and the road was buried under snow. No phone lines, no way of contacting anyone until the storm cleared. They were stuck with him. And for the first time in years, that fact terrified him. "Where were you heading?" Jack asked, turning back to find Sophie and Lily curled up on the couch, their bodies huddled close for warmth. "Anywhere but here," Sophie answered, her voice sharper than the frost outside. "We were trying to find someone who could help us, but I guess you're the only one stupid enough to live this far from civilization." Jack couldn't argue with her logic. Why were you out here in the first place? Why would your mom take you into the mountains in the middle of winter? Sophie's gaze dropped, shame flickering across her face before her stubbornness swallowed it whole. She said we had to leave the city, that it wasn't safe there anymore. "Not safe," Jack echoed, his chest tightening. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Sophie snapped, her voice cracking under the pressure of her own fear. "She just kept saying we had to get away. That someone was after us. That we couldn't trust anyone." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "And you believed her?" Sophie's expression hardened, her eyes flaring with a fire far too old for her young face. "I had to. She's my mom. What else was I supposed to do?" Jack's anger ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. He knew what desperation looked like, knew what it felt like to cling to hope when there was nothing left but darkness. And these girls, whatever mess they were running from, hadn't chosen this life. They'd just been dragged along for the ride. "Well," Jack said slowly, his voice softer now, "if she was right, then you're better off staying here for a while. Nobody's finding you in this place, not unless they know exactly where to look. Sophie eyed him warily. And why should we trust you? Jack looked her straight in the eyes, his voice carrying the weight of all the pain and guilt he buried for years. Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone. The truth hung heavy in the air between them, a fragile bridge built from shared wounds and reluctant acceptance. Sophie didn't say anything, but her posture softened, the fierce edge of her suspicion giving way to something more vulnerable. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll stay, but just until the storm clears." Jack nodded, his own heartbeat thudding in his chest like the echo of a distant avalanche. They were his responsibility now, and the weight of that realization nearly brought him to his knees. The days bowled into one another, a blur of frigid winds, stinging cold, and the persistent ache of survival. Jack threw himself into the routine of caring for the girls, trying to smother the emotions threatening to tear him apart. His cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now pulsed with life. Sophie was a tempest of defiance and mistrust, her sharp eyes watching his every move like a hawk ready to strike. Jack couldn't blame her. Whatever had happened before they stumbled upon his cabin had carved deep grooves of suspicion into her soul. She never let her guard down, not even when he caught her fingers trembling as she clutched a cup of steaming soup, or when her gaze lingered on the door as if contemplating an escape. Lily, on the other hand, was a quiet whisper of vulnerability. Her innocence clung to her like a fragile cloak, torn at the edges but stubbornly intact. She followed Jack with cautious curiosity, her footsteps soft as snowflakes. She asked questions with a child's earnestness, her voice cutting through the silence like tiny beams of light. "Why do you live all alone, Jack?" she asked one evening as he sliced logs for the fire, her tiny frame perched on the edge of the rough-hewn table, legs swinging back and forth. "Because it's easier that way," Jack replied, his voice heavy. "No one to worry about. No one to hurt. But aren't you lonely?" The question clawed at him, tearing open wounds he kept stitched shut for years. Jack's hand stilled, the hatchet's blade sinking into the wood with a dull thud. "Lonely's just a word, kid," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Some people are meant to be alone. But you're not." Lily's gaze was steady, her innocence mingling with a wisdom far beyond her years. "You let us stay." Jack didn't have an answer for that. So he turned away, his hands trembling as he resumed chopping the wood. It was easier than facing the truth. The storm outside had eased, leaving behind a brittle cold that seeped into everything. But Jack found himself dreading the day the snow would melt enough for Sophie and Lily to leave. The thought of them walking away, their tiny footprints trailing off into the wilderness, left him feeling hollow. He'd sworn to keep himself locked away from the world, to live in solitude where the only pain he had to endure was his own. But the girls had fractured his resolve, their presence a painful reminder of the life he once had and lost. Sophie rarely spoke more than necessary, but she had started helping out around the cabin. She swept the floors with stubborn determination, her arms too thin for her age, but her spirit fierce. One night, Jack caught her checking the windows and doors, her expression haunted and angry. "You don't trust me," he said from where he sat near the fire, sharpening an old hunting knife. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "Should I?" she shot back, her tone like steel. "No, but if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already." Sophie's glare wavered, her shoulders curling defensively. People pretend to be nice all the time. Then they turn on you when you least expect it. The bitterness in her voice was too familiar. Jack wondered what kind of hell she'd survived to end up here. "I get it," Jack said slowly. "You've been through things no kid should ever have to go through. But you and your sister are safe here. For now, at least." Sophie's gaze narrowed. For now. Jack hesitated. He'd been wrestling with the decision since the moment they showed up at his door, but there was no avoiding the truth anymore. Sooner or later, the storm's gonna clear. And when it does, you're gonna need help. Real help. From who? Sophie scoffed. People like you don't care about kids like us. I'm not people like me, Jack said, his voice steady. I'm just some old fool trying to do the right thing. And whether you like it or not, you need someone to get you to safety. Sophie's jaw clenched, her expression a mask of stubbornness and hurt. We were fine on our own. No, you weren't. Jack's words were harsh, but his tone was gentle. You were dying out there. Both of you. Sophie's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence between them was thick and heavy, like the dark clouds that still lurked beyond the mountains. Lily shuffled over, her small fingers wrapping around Sophie's wrist. Sophie, I think he's trying to help us. Why? Sophie whispered, her voice cracking. Why would he help us? Because I can't just watch two kids die in the snow, Jack replied, his own voice thick with emotion. And maybe because once upon a time, someone helped me when I thought I didn't deserve it. Sophie looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But she blinked them away, her defenses snapping back into place. We'll leave as soon as the snow clears. Jack nodded, the hollow ache in his chest growing heavier by the second. Yeah, I figured as much. But the truth was, he didn't want them to leave. The idea of Sophie and Lily stumbling back into a world that had already failed them felt like a betrayal of everything he was trying to make right. As the days stretched into weeks, Jack found himself searching for reasons to delay their departure. More firewood to gather. More repairs to be made to the rickety old truck parked beside the cabin. Anything to buy himself more time. But he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind, the one that whispered that their time together was running out. And when the sound of engines and shouting ripped through the tranquil air one morning, Jack realized just how true those words were. The roar of engines shattered the early morning quiet, sending Jack's senses spiraling into high alert. He'd been outside splitting wood, the cold air biting at his skin, but that noise, it wasn't the casual hum of tourists or hikers. It was urgent, angry, and it was coming straight for his cabin. Jack dropped the axe and stormed inside. Sophie and Lily were at the small table, their faces pale and strained from the constant chill that seemed to seep into their bones despite the fire's warmth. But now their eyes widened in terror. Sophie was already on her feet, grabbing Lily's wrist like she meant to bolt. Stay put, Jack ordered, his voice gruff and steady. Don't go near the windows. Who is it? Sophie asked, her voice a razor-edged whisper. The look on her face told him she was already preparing for the worst. I don't know. Jack's words came out sharper than he intended, his own panic threading through the roughness. But we're about to find out. He slid his rifle from its place above the door and braced himself. Whoever was coming wasn't lost and looking for directions. No, this was something far worse. Jack could feel it in his bones. The trucks rolled to a stop just beyond the tree line. 5 of them, their hulking frames rattling with the clinking of chains and the stomp of heavy boots. Men spilled out of them like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Their voices were loud, their laughter twisted with cruelty. Jack counted 7 of them. The ringleader was a tall, burly man with a face marred by a jagged scar cutting across his right cheek. The kind of man who thrived on intimidation. Jack Clayton. The scared man's voice boomed, his words slicing through the icy air. We know you're holed up here. Why don't you make this easy and come out like a good little hermit? Jack's fists clenched around the rifle, his knuckles turning white. That they knew his name was bad enough. But worse than that was the smugness in the man's tone. He wasn't here to negotiate. What do you want? Jack called back, his voice echoing through the trees. The scared man grinned, his teeth a flash of yellowed malice. Oh, just a couple of kids who wandered where they shouldn't have. A bounty's been put out on their pretty little heads, and we're here to collect. Jack's blood went cold. He'd figured the girls had been running from something, but bounty hunters. That was a whole new level of cruelty. And judging by the look on Sophie's face, she'd known this was coming. They found us, she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought we had more time. Jack's gaze snapped to hers. Who are they? And why the hell are they after you? They're from the group home, Sophie admitted, her voice tight with rage and terror. The one they kept sending us back to. It's bad there. Real bad. Some of the kids tried to tell the police, but they just ignored us. The staff runs some kind of operation, selling kids off. They call it adoptions, but it's just slavery. Jack's eyes narrowed. And you escaped. Barely. Sophie's jaw tightened, but they put a price on our heads, said they'd drag us back no matter what. Make us an example. The pieces snapped into place, and the rage that bloomed in Jack's chest was unlike anything he'd felt before. They were hunting children who'd already been through enough hell to last a lifetime. Listen to me, Jack said, his voice low and steady. You two need to hide. Now. There's a trapdoor under the rug in the bedroom. It leads to a crawl space. It's small, but it'll keep you safe. What about you? Lily's voice was a trembling whisper, her fingers twisting around a fraying piece of her sleeve. Jack's gaze softened. I'll handle this. You just do what I say, all right? Lily nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Sophie hesitated, her instincts clearly screaming at her to run. But she didn't. She looked Jack dead in the eyes, her expression full of a trust she was trying to fight. You can't take them all, she warned. They'll kill you. Maybe. Jack's grip tightened around the rifle. But they're not touching either of you. Not today. With a nod, Sophie grabbed Lily's hand and hurried to the back room. Jack waited until he heard the soft thud of the trapdoor closing before he moved to the front door, his rifle aimed and ready. The men outside were getting impatient. Jack could hear their muttered curses, the click of guns being loaded. They weren't here to talk anymore. Last chance, old man. The scared man called out. Hand over the brats, and maybe we'll let you keep your miserable life. Jack's reply was a gunshot that ripped through the morning air, striking the ground inches from the scared man's feet. Next one goes through your skull, Jack growled, his voice a thunderous rumble. Get off my land. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a grizzled man who looked like he was more comfortable speaking to trees than to people. But the scared man's grin only widened. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're one man against 7. You really think you can win this fight? Jack didn't answer. He simply readied himself for what was about to come. His muscles coiled with the kind of determination he hadn't felt in years. The men spread out, circling the cabin like wolves closing in on their prey. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears, but his hands were steady. They had come for the girls, but they were going to find out that Jack Clayton wasn't the kind of man who backed down when innocent lives were on the line. The gunfire tore through the morning air, a brutal symphony of violence and desperation. Jack's cabin trembled under the assault, wood splintering, glass shattering. But Jack stood his ground, his eyes blazing with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose except the lives of 2 innocent girls he had sworn to protect. He fired again, his aim precise. One of the bounty hunters collapsed with a scream, clutching his leg as blood poured from the wound. Another man howled in anger and returned fire, bullets whizzing past Jack's head. He ducked low, rolling behind the sturdy oak table he had flipped over as cover. Outside, the scared man's voice cut through the chaos. Enough of this nonsense. Light the place up. Smoke him out. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs as he heard the clinking of glass and the unmistakable whoosh of igniting gasoline. Fire. They were going to burn the cabin down. He lunged toward the back of the cabin, flinging open the small trapdoor that led to the crawl space. Sophie and Lily's wide eyes stared back at him from the darkness. Lily's cheeks were wet with tears, her tiny hands trembling as she clung to her sister. Jack, Sophie began, her voice thick with terror. No time. Jack snapped. They're trying to burn the place down. You two need to run. Head through the crawl space until you're clear of the cabin. Once you're outside, stay low, stay quiet, and keep moving. There's a dirt road about a mile east. Follow it until you reach the creek. You hear me?" Sophie nodded, her gaze never leaving Jack's. "But what about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Jack lied. "I just need to buy you some time." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "You're not coming, are you?" "I said I'll be right behind you," Jack growled. "Now go." Reluctantly, Sophie pulled Lily deeper into the crawl space, their faint whispers dissolving into the darkness. Jack slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the rug back over it. The fire was already taking hold, licking hungrily at the walls, creeping across the ceiling with blazing fingers. Smoke curled through the air, thick and suffocating. But Jack was a man who had survived worse. Much worse. And he wasn't about to let those bastards take the girls. He kicked open the front door and stormed outside, his rifle raised. The men paused, startled by his sudden appearance. Their eyes widened as they saw the fury etched across Jack's weathered face. "Didn't expect me to come out swinging, huh?" Jack's voice was a low snarl. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." The scared man sneered, but there was hesitation behind his bravado. "We've got you outnumbered, old man. You can't shoot us all." "Maybe not," Jack replied. "But I can take down enough of you to make it hurt." He fired again, his shots finding their targets with ruthless precision. Another man went down, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. The others scattered, their arrogance rapidly eroding into fear. The scared man barked orders, his voice fraying with panic. "Spread out. Corner him." But Jack was already on the move, darting from tree to tree, his rifle an extension of his own fury. The men tried to surround him, but Jack's knowledge of the land gave him the upper hand. He picked them off one by one, his shots ringing through the forest like thunder. It was only when Jack heard the shrill, desperate scream that his blood ran cold. "Sophie!" The sound tore through him like a blade, and he whipped around, his heart seizing in his chest. He saw the scared man, his fist twisted in Sophie's hair, dragging her from the underbrush. Lily stumbled behind them, her small hands clawing at the man's arm, her cries shattered by sobs. "You think you're clever, old man." The scared man's voice was a sick, gleeful growl. "I told you we'd get them. You just made it easier." Jack's hands trembled, his aim wavering as he tried to steady himself. "Let them go," he roared, his voice a wild, broken plea. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I intend to deal with you," the scared man sneered. "But first, I'm going to make you watch. Make you see what happens when you try to play hero." Jack's chest tightened, his mind racing. He couldn't afford a mistake. Not now. Not with the girls' lives hanging by a thread. He took a deep, shuddering breath and lowered his rifle, his hands raised in mock surrender. "All right. You win. Just let them go." The scared man laughed, a twisted, triumphant sound. "Now you're talking. Throw your rifle down. Kick it over." Jack's fingers clenched the rifle one last time before he released it. The weapon clattered to the ground, its cold steel a mockery of his helplessness. The scared man jerked Sophie's head back, his grip merciless. "See, that wasn't so hard. Maybe now I'll be merciful and put you out of your misery quickly." Jack's eyes flickered to Lily, who was crumpled on the ground, her sobs gut-wrenching. Sophie's own gaze was locked on him, her eyes swimming with desperation and something else. Trust. "All right then," Jack said, his voice eerily calm. "But before you pull that trigger, you might want to look behind you." The scared man snorted. "You think I'm falling for?" But the sudden feral snarl that erupted from the woods was real. A wolf. Not one of the wild ones, but Fenrir, the half-blind beast Jack had nursed back to health the previous winter. And where Fenrir went, his pack followed. The scared man's face twisted from smug arrogance to pure, unadulterated terror as the wolves emerged from the shadows, their growls low and menacing. The man released Sophie with a startled yelp, his hand fumbling for his weapon. But it was too late. The wolves surged forward, their wrath unleashed, and the screams that followed were nothing more than the pitiful sounds of cowards meeting justice. Jack rushed forward, scooping Lily into his arms and dragging Sophie to her feet. Together, they stumbled away from the carnage, Jack's arms sheltering the girls from the nightmare behind them. Only when the forest fell silent did Jack allow himself to breathe again. The nightmare was over, but the battle had only just begun.